This is really kind of a wonderful day to celebrate one of the treasured icons of the Penn Museum, which is our Colossal Sphinx. I'm sure you've all seen it today and probably many times in the past in the Lower Egyptian Gallery. Maybe just dim the lights down so that you get the images. Here it is, this magnificent beast that's been with us for a century. In the museum, kind of one of the highlights of our Egyptian gallery. Look what a magnificent creature he is. He really is a treasure in stone. He's 15 tons of solid granite. Look at the details of the carving of this particular thing. I mean, this is one of the hardest stones you could possibly work with. Egyptian sculptors created a magnificent sculpture out of this really hard volcanic stone. Look at the musculature on the back leg of him. Look at the way they show the ribs modeled on his side. It's a really kind of magnificent thing. So you might call him, just a rock. He is, after all, 15 tons of solid granite. But he really is a rock with pedigree and with style. He's many thousands of years old. A wonderful sculpture from the time of the pharaohs. We just didn't like say yes. So let's take a look at him. He is huge. He is officially one of the largest colossal sphinxes in the world. Here's his scale, 7.5 feet tall from the base to the top of his head. He would once upon a time have probably been somewhat larger than this, as we'll see. About 13 feet long and 4 feet wide. We don't actually know specifically how much he weighs. We've never had a scale that's big enough to put him on. So people don't actually know specifically how much he weighs. He's usually quoted in the range from being about 11 tons to 13 tons. Although when he first arrived at the museum 100 years ago, they first said he weighed about 11 tons. And then over the next several years in the correspondence, which we've gone through in archives, he got progressively heavier and heavier. So people started describing him as about 14 tons. The most accurate measurements we've done on him suggest that he comes in around 14 to 15 tons. But we don't know exactly, because we just never specifically measured him. So it's kind of wonderful that they moved the Sphinx from Egypt to Philadelphia. It's a distance of probably 6,000 miles on ship 100 years ago. And they didn't really know exactly how much he weighed. And a lot of the letters, we'll see some of them talk about just how heavy he was. So he's officially the largest Egyptian Sphinx in America. And in fact, he's the largest real Sphinx in the entire Western Hemisphere. As we'll see, there's a couple other large colossal sphinxes in other parts of the world, but he's officially would be the fourth largest sphinx outside of Egypt. And when we say sphinx, we do talk about him as a sculpture of a number of different types of sculptures that adorned the creator of the Sphinx, or at least the person that we identify this particular Sphinx with, the very famous pharaoh Ramses the Great, or Ramses II. Ramses II is just one actually of 11 kings who reigned about 1200, or roughly 1300 to 1050 BC in the time of Egypt's empire. The golden age of Egypt was the New Kingdom. Probably a lot of you are familiar with that. Ramses is one of just 11 kings in what we call the later New Kingdom. So his reign is about 1300 to close to 1200 BC. He was a really long reigning king. He's the second longest reigning pharaoh in ancient Egyptian history. So 67 years for his reign. He was pretty elderly when he passed away. And actually, his first 12 sons, he had about 120 children. Many wives, that's not just one single wife, obviously, but many queens were the mothers of his roughly 120 children. But he lived so long that his first 12 sons died before he did. And another pharaoh, whose name actually appears on our Sphinx, Merenptah, who's the owner and builder of the palace of Memphis, which is partially displayed up around the Sphinx in the Lower Egyptian Gallery. He was the 13th son of Ramses. His name also appears on the Sphinx, along with his father's. So Ramses was a great temple builder. His claim to fame were just the massive temples and sculptures that he left us. Some people think he was a bit of a egomaniac. I don't know if that's true, but he certainly was interested in commemorating himself in his great sculpture. So our Sphinx is one of the many colossal figures of this king, Ramses II. So with his reign, he's about, the Sphinx dates to about 12 to 1300 BC. He's about 3,300 years old. But actually, we do know that one of the things about Ramses, for which he's well known, is he had a penchant for not just building new temples and carving new sculptures for himself, but he actually enjoyed taking over older kings' temples and sculptures. It's really kind of a shame to waste statues of old kings that are laying around. So Ramses had his agents and sculptors go around Egypt and gather up colossal figures and recarve them, put his name on them. There's some evidence that our Sphinx actually dates to quite a bit earlier than the reign of Ramses II. We think it probably dates initially to about 2000 BC and was carved for an earlier pharaoh whose name no longer exists on it. Ramses took it over and recarved it. So the easiest thing is to say this is a Sphinx of Ramses the Great or Ramses II. A little bit of a complicated story, but anyway, that's part of it. Our Colossal Sphinx in the Penn Museum is not the largest Sphinx in the United States. Many of you are familiar with this place. I don't know if anyone's been here. Anyone been to the Luxor Casino in Las Vegas? This is officially the largest Sphinx in America, and actually the largest Sphinx in the entire world, because it's quite a bit bigger than even the famous Great Sphinx of Giza. I forget. I've never been here, actually. I don't know how tall this is. You happen to know if you've been there? 100 feet or more? It's a big Sphinx, obviously, but it's a fake Sphinx. So we usually do place emphasis on real Sphinxes. Quite a bit smaller is our 15-ton colossal Sphinx from Memphis, as we're going to talk about. The world of Sphinxes is kind of a wonderful thing to delve into and examine. There's all kinds of different types of Sphinxes. They come in this form that's very familiar, sort of the recumbent form, where the Egyptians really capture very beautifully the feline kind of attitude of sitting at rest with your paws out in front. So this is the kind of the most familiar form of Sphinxes, and our Sphinx takes that shape. But Sphinxes also can be active. Many statues of Sphinxes and images of Sphinxes show them becoming active, and one of the things they do, because they have the body of a lion, is they can actually become agents of destruction. They're not evil or intentionally destructive beasts, but they can call upon these powers of the lion. So the Sphinx really, at its core, is a combination of the physical strength and energy of a lion combined with the human head. The pharaoh's head is on top of it, the intelligence of a human, and the sort of wisdom of a pharaoh in one being. So usually what Sphinxes do is they guard entrances to sacred locations, temples in many cases, and in the case of the Great Sphinx of Giza, actually a pyramid complex from relatively early in Egypt's history. There aren't actually that many colossal Sphinxes in the world. There are hundreds and hundreds of Sphinxes of a great range of size, but when you're talking about the world of colossal Sphinxes, it's a pretty limited roundup. Far and away the biggest real Sphinx, excluding the Las Vegas one, is the Great Sphinx of Giza. It's carved out of the bedrock and shaped into the form of a Sphinx. If you go down below that to the realm of what we might call the portable Sphinxes, ones that aren't rooted to the bedrock, you go down quite a lot in size. And the next largest Sphinx in the world is this one, which today can be seen in Memphis, in the ruins of the ancient capital of the pharaohs, just south of Cairo. We'll take a look at it in just a second. This is what's called the Great Alabaster Sphinx of Memphis. Interestingly, this Sphinx has a lot of very close association with our Sphinx, the Penn Museum's Colossal Sphinx. Both of them were found in the same year, and actually very close together. So our Sphinx and this one, we'll take a look at them. Some of the other colossal Sphinxes around the world, there's a magnificent pair of them in Russia, in St. Petersburg. I'll show you some images of that, or that pair of them. And also there's a big guy in Paris. If you've been to the Louvre, you might have gone down into the crypt of the Sphinx. There's a pretty good sized Sphinx there. These ones are definitely bigger than our Sphinx, but ours would be the fourth largest in the world outside of those ones. He's ranking pretty high up there in terms of the size of Sphinxes. So where does the Sphinx come from? He comes from a very important city in ancient Egypt. This is the city called Memphis. Memphis was the ancient capital of the pharaohs. It was founded around 3000 BC, and it has a history that lasts over thousands of years. Here's its location. It's just a little bit south of modern Cairo, and located on the western side of the Nile. You just see in the schematic. Memphis is the city that really spawned the pyramids. The pharaohs that lived here over the earliest dynasties of Egyptian history built the great pyramids that extend all along the edge of the desert here, all the way up to the great pyramid site of Giza, where the Great Sphinx is located. And our Sphinx actually comes from the ruins of the central part of Memphis, where there was a huge temple dedicated to a god named Ptah, spelled P-T-A-H. The P is a silent one, just like in pterodactyl. So we call him Ptah, but it's spelled Ptah. He was the patron god, a very important creator god, and the temple in the center of Memphis was where he was honored and worshipped, including in the time of Ramses II. We have huge remnants of gigantic structures that were built in the center of Memphis by Ramses II. He's probably the greatest builder of the Ptah temple, and his buildings seem to have stood for many, many centuries before they began to fall apart and be replaced. So our Sphinx comes from Memphis. It was discovered, in fact, by a guy who had quite a lot of luck in the business of finding Sphinxes. He's practically an unknown archaeologist. He did some pretty important things, actually. But for today, maybe his most important discoveries are the two Sphinxes he found. In 1912 was a great year for Sphinxes and the discovery of Sphinxes at Memphis. This guy, Ernest Mackay, he actually discovered, in back-to-back excavations, the great alabaster Sphinx, which you see there, is discovered laying on its side. They first found its rump, and they found this gigantic alabaster tail sticking out of the earth. And as they uncovered it, they found the monstrous alabaster Sphinx. So there's just a news clipping from 1912 talking about it, estimating its weight at about 80 to 90 tons. Today it still sits at Memphis. They really couldn't move it very far. All they did was essentially move it up and place it upright. Just north of here, the Penn Museum Sphinx was found. However, our Sphinx is a bit lighter, coming in at roughly 15 tons. It was portable, and so they decided to offer it to the museum because of the sponsorship that the museum was giving to the excavations that were conducted by Ernest Mackay. Ernest Mackay was actually a guy working for a very famous archaeologist. Some of you probably know about him. Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie, he's usually just called Flinders Petrie. He's often called the father of Egyptian archaeology. This guy excavated over his career over 100 different sites in Egypt. And often the way he did it is he kind of subcontracted to field supervisors like Mackay. He raised the funds, he organized the excavations, he was the overall director. During this time period, he had an organization called the British School of Archaeology in Egypt, and our museum was the sponsor of those excavations, so that's why the Sphinx came to us. These are three guys that are responsible for the Sphinx being in Philadelphia. Flinders Petrie, his excavations in Memphis that Ernest Mackay was doing, and these two individuals, very influential, important men in the history of our museum. Eckley Cox, who you see here, he was a wealthy Philadelphian who just loved Egypt, interested in Egyptology. He gave a lot of money for excavations and also the construction of the Egyptian wing of the museum in which the Sphinx now resides. And this fellow, George Byron Gordon, who was then director of the museum, he was actually the first director of the museum for 17 years. And his parents played a little bit of a nasty trick on him when they named him George Byron Gordon. If you Google him, it's very hard to find out anything out about him, because what you find out about is this fellow, the very well-known poet, George Gordon Byron. I don't know, I guess his parents were English teachers or enjoyed poetry or something. So I guess the name confusion can often confuse the two. They both had mustaches, but George Byron Gordon's mustache is much more impressive than this fellow's was, at least in that time period when it was made. So the reason the Sphinx is in Philadelphia is that Flinders Petrie, in 1912, when our Sphinx was excavated, decided it should be placed in a museum. It wasn't going to remain, they weren't going to rebury it. They decided not to leave it in Memphis. Basically, it was found under fields, which were going to return to use for agriculture. So they removed it, and he offered it to the Penn Museum. And here's this lovely letter where it's the beginning of a long correspondence about sending the Sphinx to Philadelphia. He says to George Gordon, during the summer, we have raised at Memphis a colossal Sphinx of Ramses II, about 11 feet long, 11-ton weight. His figures are a little low. The head has been much weathered. The body and inscribed base are perfect of red granite. The face might be restored from a mold of another Sphinx of the same size. Would such a piece as this be acceptable to the museum? The director responded, of course, yes, we're very interested in this wonderful Sphinx. He also, there's a number of letters where they talk about restoring the face. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Fortunately, they decided never to attempt that. So the Sphinx came to Philadelphia shortly after this. The Sphinx officially arrived in Philadelphia on October 7th of 1913, so just about a year after it first was offered. This is the beginning of a long love affair between Philadelphia and our colossal Sphinx. The day that he arrived actually was the beginning of a bunch of attempts by Philadelphians and writers around this time to try and envision the sort of the knowledge, the ancient wisdom of this great Sphinx. My favorite newspaper article of many that were written around this time is this one that came out it's a defunct newspaper, went out of business long ago. Back in 1913, Philadelphia had well over a dozen daily newspapers, and one of them was the North American. And there's this lovely interview with the Sphinx, which is really kind of humorous and fun to read. Part of it says, in the words of Ramses, "First, where am I, Philadelphia? Never heard its name before. Is it many miles from Karnak? Is it near to great Luxor? What are these fragile buildings? Not a pyramid I see. Where's the palace? Where's the temple? Where's a home for such as me?" So here's the home he came to, our Penn Museum. There's all kinds of really fun and interesting stuff about the Sphinx and its journey to Philadelphia that are in archives in our museum and also in some of the records of the Port of Philadelphia. Here's just a list of the merchandise that actually the Sphinx traveled with. The Sphinx came on a German steamship called the Schildturm. We actually have the document that lists the stuff that traveled over the Atlantic with the Sphinx. It's a really kind of a weird, motley assortment of things. The main thing that was on this ship was goat skins. There were hundreds of bales of goat skins that were coming from India to be turned into leather in the Philadelphia tanneries. And there's giant containers also of fruit, which were used for creating dye in the leather making industry. So there's some other stuff too. There's manganese and cotton, a few other things. But included in this is one granite Sphinx headed for the University of Pennsylvania Museum. So kind of a weird mix of stuff in this steamship that crosses the Atlantic. One of the things they were worried about back then, of course, the Sphinx was crossing during the hurricane season. Actually, the Sphinx arrived late because it did encounter some stormy weather, but they actually took out a maritime insurance policy on the Sphinx. It was registered for £1,000 in case the ship sunk at sea. Luckily, it didn't end up on the bottom of the Atlantic, but it made it. But in case of that, they would have been able to cash in on this maritime insurance. The fun thing about it is in in the insurance policy that they took out, it mentions the ship and everything. And it doesn't say it's a Sphinx that they were insuring. It calls it in French, une pierre antique, an ancient rock is what the Sphinx was for insurance purposes. So there it is. One of the things that is fascinating in all the correspondence and the story of the Sphinx found in Philadelphia is how astounded everyone was at the size of it. Everyone that encountered it, all the guys that were involved in moving it, were kind of unhappy, actually, at the size of the Sphinx. Here you see it actually on a wheeled cart in Cairo before it was loaded on the ship. Almost everyone that was involved in moving it complained, and they tried to get more money because they said it was just so damn heavy. So there's this one guy that probably didn't get any extra pay, but anyway, some other people, including the Schildturm, the ship, the people that moved the Sphinx across the Atlantic, they demanded additional freight. And in fact, the captain of the ship called it undesirable cargo because it was so heavy. Obviously, these bales of goat skins were a lot easier to deal with than this giant Sphinx. So there's all kinds of interesting stuff. One of the fun things about the Sphinx is that when it arrived in Philadelphia, just purely by luck, October 7th was the beginning of the World Series, and Philadelphia was in the World Series that year against New York. This was the 1913 World Series, was the Philadelphia Athletics against the New York Giants. There's just a flyer from the game. And the city seems to have been kind of crazy. You get a sense of it from these photographs of the old Scheid Field, which was up in North Philadelphia. It no longer exists. All these guys up on the roofs where you could get a cheapo ticket to see the game. They couldn't actually get guys to unload the Sphinx at the port. There weren't enough guys. They had to wait several days until the World Series fever had kind of calmed down. And it's kind of fun. The fact that the Sphinx arrived at this time, it was covered in the newspapers along with the World Series. You can see in the Philadelphia Inquirer this cartoon of the World Series. They're kind of dominating the news. There's a bunch of issues of the day, including international affairs. There's a wretched lady kind of climbing up the side of the world, and the sign, can't quite see it there, it says, "Votes for Women." Of course, this was before women's suffrage, back in 1913. She's putting a peg in for women's right to vote, and it's all covered in kind of neat correspondence at the time. They also had trouble finding a crane to get the Sphinx out. The way they eventually got it out of the boat was this giant crane that you see here, which was up in Port Richmond. They picked it out of the Schildturm and put it on a rail car and brought it over by rail to the Schuylkill River. And there's another interesting side of it. It sat there for actually several days. They couldn't find anyone who was willing to bring it across the Schuylkill River. It was practically at the museum, but they hadn't quite made it. Finally, they made arrangements, and it was put onto this big, heavy cart that was drawn by, and the stories vary, anywhere from 9 to 14 horses. It's not quite clear. We think there were probably 9 horses, a horse-drawn carriage. And here's how it arrived. So it was wrapped in burlap on top of this. There's these wonderful accounts in the papers of the time of this sort of parade as the Sphinx came up Market Street and then to the front of the museum. And then there's the final problem they had. You guys all came in, and you're familiar with the entrance to the museum. You have to climb up those steps to the upper garden. There it is, exactly the same form back in 1913. They had to get the Sphinx over the wall of the museum. So they had to erect a special crane to do that, and tracks out of railroad ties in order to slide it up and over. So that took several days. So officially the Sphinx arrived at the museum in October 19th, about 12 days after it had come to Philadelphia. One of the things that attracted people to the Sphinx was, of course, Franklin Field, where there's ongoing a lot of sports activity going on still today. The main stadium for the university. One of the things people wondered about was what Ramses, the Sphinx of Ramses, would think of modern sports events. And there's coverage of the Sphinx becoming sort of a good luck token for Penn football. And then even these accounts where they kind of envision what the Sphinx might think of modern sports. And one of the games that happened shortly after the Sphinx arrived was a horrible defeat to Cornell. Penn lost terribly. And there's this lovely story, it's just one example, that says, Penn's grief-stricken students have gone home for Thanksgiving vacation. Ramses II, Royal Egyptian Sphinx, is unable to suppress his tears. His stone face streams with water. All night long he is said to have wailed and cried over the ignominious defeat. It goes on in this way of envisioning what the ancient Egyptian king might think of the football games. When they brought the Sphinx to the museum, there actually was no place to put him originally. The museum didn't include all of the components that it does now. They hadn't actually built the big Chinese rotunda, and the Egyptian wing didn't exist. So for several years, it just lived outside. It was propped up on some of the railroad ties that have been used to slide it into the garden. It's kind of pretty. There are beautiful photographs of it, kind of presiding over the garden setting. It was there for about 3 years, but people began to get worried about it. Particularly in 1914, there was quite a cold winter, and one giant snowstorm, which was kind of a nice opportunity for people to photograph the Sphinx covered in snow. But some of the newspaper stories at the time began to talk about the damage that might result from this weathering. The Sphinx, of course, comes from a warm climate. What was the snow of Philadelphia do to it? And they again give the Sphinx a voice. It says, the Sphinx was cold as the frozen north, and it made his 2-ton figure shake. That's a little bit wrong. We know he's a lot more than that. It says, beware, at last he sputtered forth, or my granite frame will freeze and break. Once I was young and brave and bold, but now, egad, I'm getting old, and I want to be out of the bitter cold and go back home to bake. So again, it's fun to kind of envision what the Sphinx might think of his changed location in Philadelphia. They probably could have actually left the Sphinx outside. He is solid granite. And by comparison, 2 of the other large colossal sphinxes in the world live in St. Petersburg in Russia, which has a heck of a lot colder climate than we do. They've been there since 1832, sitting outdoors in front of what's now the Hermitage Museum. And they look like they're in pretty darn good shape still. They don't seem to have suffered too much. But they were worried about the Sphinx. And so in 1916, it was moved indoors. So there he is in a warmer setting. You guys, where you come into the main entrance of the museum, that's where he was for about 10 years. Really kind of nice place, welcoming people. And then in 1926, they finally completed the Egyptian wing, what we call the Cox wing, with funds that actually Cox gave. And so the Sphinx at that time was moved into the lower Egyptian gallery, exactly where he sits today. He hasn't moved at all since then. So, going on 90 years or so, still in his home in the lower Egyptian gallery. One of the wonderful things about our Sphinx, one of the things people, I think, that does kind of attract people to this Sphinx is the fact that he's not a perfect Sphinx. Once upon a time, he would have had a beautifully carved face, but his face is eroded. I mean, the lower body of it's in beautiful shape, but at some point, the body must have been buried and just the head exposed. So the head really does kind of reflect the ravages of time, the thousands of years of the life of this ancient Sphinx. So he is kind of the embodiment of a Sphinx in the sense that is captured in this wonderful description of a Sphinx close to 150 years ago by Mark Twain. When he first encountered the great Sphinx at Giza, he looked upon this thing with awe. It's really kind of a wonderful statement. I won't read all of it, but it says, the Sphinx was looking over and beyond everything of the present and far into the past. It was gazing out over the ocean of time, over lines of century waves, which further and further receding closed nearer and nearer together and blended at last into one unbroken tide away beyond the horizon of remote antiquity. It was thinking of the wars of departed ages, of the empires it had seen created and destroyed, of the nations whose birth it had witnessed, whose progress it had watched, whose annihilation it had noted, of the joy and sorrow, the life and death, the grandeur and decay of 5,000 slow revolving years. This is a description of the great Sphinx at Giza, but really sort of the sentiments that Mark Twain really captures here, I think, apply to our wonderful Sphinx. Our Sphinx is a quintessential Sphinx. This time-eroded face really captures the age and the antiquity of it. It's fun to kind of envision what it might think of its place in Philadelphia today. We can't, of course, know what Ramses II would think. It's just a big rock, after all. But one of the things we can do is envision what the face might once have been like. We do have some other images of Ramses II in our museum. If you go upstairs into the upper Egyptian gallery, there's another statue of Ramses. Also granite, a seated figure of him. And it's kind of fun. We can use Photoshop to restore and give a sense of what the Sphinx might once have looked like with another image of Ramses II on there. So it gives you a little bit of a sense of what the Sphinx might have looked like. We go beyond that, actually. One of the things we know about the Sphinx is it originally had paint on it. The granite is beautiful, but the Egyptians always painted their statues and their temples. And we know that the Sphinx would have had, the headdress on it would have had stripes of blue and yellow like that. Of course, the face would have been painted with flesh tones, and the inscriptions would have been illuminated, picked out with a different color to stand out against the background. So something like this. Of course, the exact form of the face is speculative. Something like that. And the other fun thing, of course, is that there's probably some things that are missing on our Sphinx. We know that Sphinxes of Ramses the Great, during this time period, almost every Sphinx he built, he put a giant crown on top of it. There's this regular crown that's called the nemes, which is the type of crown that's familiar from the gold mask of Tutankhamun. And there you see it on another Sphinx. But almost every Sphinx, almost every colossal figure of Ramses II also has what's called the double crown stuck on top of that. And almost assuredly, once upon a time, our Sphinx would have been capped by a double crown. So you have to try and picture him with this additional element on top of his head. That might give you a little bit of a sense of it. So right now he's wearing his party hat upstairs, but in ancient times, the idea of a hat would have been familiar to him in the form of what's called the double crown, the red and the white crown, which the pharaoh wears as his symbol of his rulership of Egypt. So anyway, that's it. I hope that gives you guys a little bit of appreciation for our wonderful Sphinx, and I think at 3 or 3:30, my wife Jennifer is going to be talking more about Sphinxes, the wonderful world of Sphinxes. So if you're interested in more detail on Sphinxes and all the kind of wonderful forms they take, come back for that. Okay, so enjoy the day.